This lesson is part of our 5th grade Social Studies Unit 3, Colonization and Settlement. In this lesson, we will be learning about European settlement and Native Americans. Our learning target is to explain the impact of European contact on Native American cultures. We will be able to explain positive and negative consequences for indigenous people groups who had originally lived in the colonial areas, and explain reasons for the increase of conflict between the groups over time. There are 3 vocabulary words that will be useful to know for this lesson. A contradiction is when 2 ideas or actions are in conflict. The fact that the Puritans came to North America to find religious freedom, but then denied others religious freedom, is a contradiction. A perspective means how a person looks at a problem or an event. Native Americans and English colonists had different perspectives about land. A treaty is a formal signed agreement between 2 or more nations. The English settlers and Native Americans signed treaties that often resulted in Native Americans losing their land. The word contradiction refers to 2 ideas or actions that are in conflict. There were often contradictions between what the settlers believed and how they treated Native Americans. Here are some examples. Many settlers wanted the freedom to own their own land. However, they took over Native American lands and pushed them further and further west. That is a contradiction. Many settlers believed in religious freedom and the right to worship as they pleased. However, the English wanted Native Americans to convert to Christianity because they thought Native American religions were wrong. An additional example of a contradiction is that many settlers believed people should be free to make their own choices and live their own life, but denied Native Americans freedom. The encounters between the European settlers and the indigenous people of North America had many consequences. While there were some positives, such as trade and new technology, the negative consequences outweighed the positives. The chart shows the costs of these encounters. Many deaths of Native Americans occurred due to the exposure to European diseases. Additionally, Native Americans were pushed off of the land that they had lived on for generations and forced to move further and further west. Indigenous people were also enslaved by Europeans and treated like property as they were forced to work. Native Americans also suffered the loss of hunting grounds, which were necessary to provide food, clothing, shelter, and more to their people. Over time, conflict between the Native Americans and European settlers grew. One of the main sources of conflict was that they had different perspectives or viewpoints about land. Native Americans believed that people could use land but would never truly own it. In contrast, Europeans believed people had a right to own the land. This differing perspective led to disagreements about what was agreed upon when Europeans paid Native Americans for land, or when treaties were signed. When these events took place, Native Americans had the perspective it meant both groups would still use the land. On the other hand, Europeans had the perspective that it was now owned by them. Disagreements about land were a significant source of conflict. Additionally, the arrival of European settlers led to competition for resources, and Native Americans being pushed off their land. Sometimes their crops were trampled or destroyed by settler animals. Due to the increased conflict, Native Americans were pushed farther and farther west. English colonists began to settle in new areas. Sadly, many people were killed on both sides. These were effects of the conflict. Let's review our learning target. Which of the events below were causes of conflict between the Native Americans and the English settlers? Which were the effects of conflict? Numbers 1, 4, and 5 were causes of conflict. Numbers 2, 3, and 6 were results of the conflict. Now you can click Next to take the quiz for this lesson.